Welcome to the Human Origin Project, where we explore the science of you. To keep up to date, go to our iTunes channel and subscribe, and please leave a review if you enjoyed today's show. DMT and its effect on human consciousness has been explored in clinical trials by Dr. Nick Strassman using endogenous DMT in subjects in the 90s. Since then, conjecture has arisen on the physiology of how DMT acts on the brain. Traditional plant medicine such as ayahuasca and the lesser-known Acacia tree show humans have been utilising the properties of DMT for thousands and thousands of years. What do these medicinal practices and experiences tell us about the human mind's control over our reality, health, and consciousness? In this episode, I discuss with author of the paper Deep Ecology of Ayahuasca Discourse, Jef Baker, on the history, cross-botanical, and global fascination with psychoactive plants. Jef is the president of the Sydney chapter of the Australian Psychedelic Society and dives into the rich human story, state of research, and personal experiences with DMT practices. Hey Jef, thanks for joining me today.
How's it going, Sue?
Yeah, good mate. Yeah, I've been looking forward to talking about this. We met probably a few months back now. We've been talking back and forth.
Yeah, a couple of months.
Yeah. There's an interesting story about, your kind of training and how it's kind of led you down this path of exploring, very fundamental things that really go back a long way in human history. And I'm really looking forward to diving into that.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think it sort of works both ways. The plants lead me to study, and the study came from my sort of obsession with psychoactive plants that developed at quite a young age.
Absolutely, yeah. And so, tell us about your training. So you've got a PhD.
No. I've got an honours thesis in cultural studies and communications, and I was set to do a PhD, but I put that on hold, which I'm quite glad, because I was going to look at ways and techniques people use to integrate psychedelic experiences, and how communities form through that. But for other sort of life reasons, I chose to come to Sydney and work for some crazy reason. But yeah, it's given me time to sort of think, actually, what would I really, really like to study if I could? And I think, as we spoke, looking at the modern use of Acacia and the emergence of that, and then tying that back to the ancient use of Acacia, I think is a very under-researched area. So much to know about acacias that we don't know yet, in almost every field, in taxonomy and botany, and let alone the anthropological side of things. That's not greatly studied.
That's what really struck me about the story, is that we're kind of hearing a lot about South American ceremonial use of ayahuasca and DMT, and there's a lot of discussion about that. But there is a huge story all around the world and Acacia is central to it. And you go back into Egyptian literature, some of the most fundamental mythological stories.
The Tree of Life.
The Tree of Life. Right?
That's the beginning of everything. And all these different cultures have a world tree at their core, which I think points to the idea that they understood that we originally all came from plants, that plants were the first life form on the planet, and everything emerges out of that. Hence the world tree, or a tree of knowledge, a tree of life, as the origins of everything, is quite a common trope in different mythologies of different cultures.
Yeah. And we were talking just before about the Egyptian acacia. Its base grows around the Nile, which is one of the most.
Hence its name, the Lotica, I believe.
Yeah. And the mythology kind of goes that one of their primary gods, Osiris, was born of an acacia, Nilotica, and he was also referred to as the tree god. You keep finding this reference, to acacia, and it never really. Until I started to kind of think about, the branching of how all this happened, began to think about how fundamental, the acacia tree really is to the human story. These are very, very, the Egyptian culture goes back right to our roots of, where the cradle of civilization starts.
Exactly. It's quite prevalent in most Mesopotamian cultures, the use of acacia for, obviously it's a good food source. It has the gum is very useful. The wood is extremely hardy and really good to build with. There's a lot of biblical references to building with acacia, but also building extremely sacred things like the Ark of the Covenant,
Absolutely.
The crown of thorns even,
Yeah, there's
significance placed on it for a reason, I believe.
Yeah, that was an acacia. Was it a branch? Was it or the
Nilotica, I believe.
Yeah,
right. It's a thorned acacia.
Isn't that amazing? And there was a really practical side of it as well, like the boat of Ra that they say was built in acacia.
Yeah, built half of acacia and half of palm wood. Yeah,
yeah, that's right, palm wood, and then it's the back portion.
The back was acacia.
Yeah.
So, sure exactly why he did the half and half there.
There would be a purpose, though, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, yeah,
it's all usually functional or ritual.
Yeah, and
interesting.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And the gum is used to blending and smoothing of fats, and they use it for candy making. So they just had this, broad splattering, really treasured use of the plant. And across Mesopotamia as well, the word Acacia, Akakia, is used by the Byzantine priests, but that represents a cylinder of purple silk that contained dust, which was with the metaphorical dust from which mankind was formed to symbolize immortal nature.
There you go. Yeah, origins again,
It's interesting, because once, it was really when I started talking to you that the story of the acacia began to come out. And, your journey in this got deep, roots in stories all around the world. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, tell us how did you first get, when did it first come onto your radar to start looking into the acacia plant?
Well, I guess I could go right back to my interest in psychoactive plants, which began quite young, 16, just left school. I was sort of kicking around in the punk scene in Auckland in the mid-late 80s, and I'd just finished reading The Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley's story of his mescaline journey, and I picked it up for a couple of dollars in a bookstore on the merit of Brave New World, and sort of finished reading. I was like, I don't really understand what that was about, or quite what aspects were fact and what aspects were fiction. And then synchronistically, a day or two later, I just went around to a squat and they were brewing up cactus. And, let's drink some cactus, shits and giggles sort of thing. It's like, okay, let's do it. But very, very quickly, it struck me the significance of this state of mind, that this was nothing to joke around with. This is what just like smoking a joint. There was some serious implications to this, and I was struck with the profound feeling of familiarity. Like, how do I remember this experience? I have no reference point in this life to having done this before. Where is this familiarity coming from? And that just lingered for hours. And and so that led me into just exploring the different psychoactive substances floating around, and the mushrooms that grow in New Zealand. But that weekend that I first drank the cactus, that same weekend for the next 4 years, the cactus would just appear in my life randomly, which was really, really nice synchronicity and a good sign of the power of these plants, that they will weave meaning into your life, whether you're aware of it or not, and they'll make you aware of it. And so, I experimented and explored for quite a few years, and then, I had family and kids and career sort of fell off my radar for a little while. And then I went to university in 2010, studied arts basically, and did a bit of psychology, did a bit of sociology, and then discovered cultural studies. And doing philosophy, it suddenly hit me how existentialism and metaphysics and all the theoretical philosophy just all related to my experience of psychedelics. It was all just so parallel that thought, wow, there's room here to weave psychedelics into social sciences. And that led me to graduating and then moving on to doing an honours thesis. And obviously I was seeing ayahuasca in the media everywhere and having experience with ayahuasca. But I sort of really wanted to write something about it as a sort of strange attractor to bring it into my life. And so I wrote about the way that ayahuasca is spoken about embodies a deep ecological philosophy, because I kept seeing the way it was referenced to as a female plant entity, a plant spirit, and how people would have profound experiences of connection to nature, which really resonated with my experience on cactus particularly. But I wanted to be very careful not to speak for the experience because I hadn't had it yet. And so that was a good way to use online data of people's experiences to analyze the way it was discussed, sort of a discourse analysis. And yeah, lo and behold, that sort of led me to people in ayahuasca, I guess you would call it a scene, but people with access to ceremony, and bang, yeah. And around that same time, I was given some DMT, and I was told that it was obtusifolia, and it actually came from the mountains behind where I was living at the time, up on the north coast. And I sat with that for a couple of months, looking for a good safe spot to have it, and wanting to be really super prepared. And so I eventually found a nice spot down by the beach and laid the DMT between some carpi leaf, some ayahuasca vine leaf, and was very quickly catapulted into a completely other realm, as I read about, breakthrough, as they say. But as soon as I entered this other space, this little thing came out to greet me, and it had a little sort of fluffy white head about the size of your index finger, and big green splayed sort of rabbit-like ears, and it was just, yeah, you made it, this sort of congratulatory excitement. And perhaps that in part is your own self congratulating, oh, you broke through on DMT, well done. But also this was something else. This was an independent plant spirit, didn't quite recognize it as a plant at the time. I was like, okay, that was weird. It was about 6 months later, and I really at the time didn't know what an acacia was for a gum tree. I really couldn't identify the species. I started looking into it a little bit, getting more familiar with it. I was driving along the road, and all this acacia was blowing in the wind, and it was in flower. I was like, that's what I saw. That was the little fluffy white pendulate flower.
Wow.
And the big green rubbery phyllodes, leaves that appeared like ears in my vision, were the phyllodes of Acacia obtusifolia. And what I saw was an exact depiction of Acacia obtusifolia, probably 6 months prior to my having any knowledge of what it looked like.
Isn't that amazing? And so
yeah.
So you were pushed down into this road of understanding the acacia tree, and so it was through psychoactive plants that had an experience. But then and you kind of said when you had the experience with mescaline that it was a feeling that you'd been there before, which is really kind of I mean, it's interesting. Because now we've kind of been studying this for somewhat decades, Strassman. People
I'd say 100+ years. I mean, the discovery of mescaline goes back to the late 19th century, early 20th century. And it's a quite often forgotten chapter of psychedelic history, this sort of period, the turn of the century into the 20th century, and prior to the discovery of LSD, there was really popular use of mescaline within the sort of philosophical circuits and writers in Europe, and Jean Paul Sartre and those sort of people were having mescaline experiences, and it's interesting what I meant by that is that we're trying the clinical studies are starting to kind of start to understand this stuff. It's becoming mainstream to a certain extent.
Right. But the uses of these plants and its application into cultural across many kind of even kind of closed circuit kind of communities it goes back a long way, as you say. And to me, while we're starting to move into this period where we're using these kind of substances for clinical research, all these kind of things, PTSD. There are some
enormous potential. And it's sad because we did know these things prior to the prohibition of LSD and pretty much all psychoactive substances. There was over 1,000 papers written on LSD prior to its outlawing. Looking at treating alcoholism and depression, anxiety, and obviously depression and anxiety weren't prevalent nearly to the extent they are now. Perhaps they were, but they weren't identified as such. I think it's pretty clear we have more depression and anxiety in our society now than perhaps we did in the 50s. It's sad because we knew the potential of these substances, and Nixon, for whatever political reasons, vendetta, Larry, or whatever, decided to outlaw it. And I mean, also the CIA was studying these things. They knew the potential as well, but obviously their agenda was to try and weaponize it somehow. A little bit too unpredictable for that, so I think they sort of canned it. That's not to say that the program closed. I mean, I believe it continued on. And they were looking at DMT as well, which was a pretty obscure substance in the 60s. There wasn't a lot of people doing it. It wasn't as socially transportable as LSD, or physically transportable in the sense that you could sort of just take it anywhere and, like they were with LSD.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you say unpredictability, because that's, that in clinical trials just don't go, right? So it's a hard thing to study and really kind of obviously make guidelines on, make concrete findings in research sets. It's just it's a difficult area, but it really is happening now. I've the studies. I mean, there was just recently. The understanding of DMT in particular is starting to bubble up now, and recently there was a study. There's Jimo Borgen, who's a PhD in molecular integrative physiology, who isolated DMT in mammalian brains, and this is the first kind of besides,
this is the proof everyone's been looking for that DMT is produced in the pineal glands.
It's getting there, we're right. That's it. And it was kind of all hovering around, but then we're kind of led to this idea that this is all around in nature. It's in our history. It's deep in our history. And Acacia is a very, very old plant that contains, a good percentage of them contain dimethyltryptamine, and so we're starting to see this story really bubble up. And that's
as Dennis McGuinness says, nature's drenched in DMT, and it is. From reading Andrew Gallimore work, it is one of these really old compounds. It's sort of like a building block to, at a very, very early point in human evolution, alongside serotonin. And I think that's interesting that the compounds are so similar. And, he sort of puts forth the way that serotonin has a lot to do with the way we construct our reality, how we take in sensory information and build a coherent image and world and build our reality. And when you replace it with DMT, this complete other reality is formed in your brain, like a parallel reality that's completely different to this one, but often feels like it's been there all along, like you've stepped into this zone that has been existing and will continue to exist when you step out of it again. Like quite often you hear people talk about DMT experiences where they suddenly like they've stepped into a room and there's some bizarre creatures working on something, and they go, "Hey, what are you doing here?" They tell you to piss off. They say, "Hey, come join us. We're fixing this thing," or whatever, And then they leave again. And it's like you get the sense that they've just been doing this all along, and they'll keep doing it. And you've just sort of stepped into their world and interrupted them. And
that's interesting because, physiologically, we can explain that now because serotonin, derives from tryptophan in the pineal gland, which converts to melatonin, which is the sleep hormone.
Melatonin is definitely produced in the pineal gland, and there's a sort of a pathway, you know, from melatonin to, as you said, tryptophan, serotonin, and then perhaps down the line to N-dimethyltryptamine and 5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine. Sort of, you know, itching for this to be proven. And I mean, perhaps it's not the case. I mean, we know that DMT's been found in cerebrospinal fluid, it's produced in the lungs, a lot of serotonin is produced in the gut. It's not all happening in the brain. And the suggestion for endogenous DMT in the pineal gland has become a real sort of popular myth, thanks to Strassman. And, you know, he did write in The Spirit Molecule that it was a speculative theory, that it wasn't, you know, a hard fact. But it just took a life of its own. It absolutely just, people grabbed it and ran with it because it was so appealing, because the pineal gland is, you know, has such esoteric meaning for many cultures, particularly, you know, through alchemical traditions and all the way back to Egypt, and even references to it in the Vatican. And, you know, it's this sort of very mysterious part of the brain, the only part of the brain that's not bicameral and divided. It's the unitary piece of the brain. It's a very, very tiny organ. And if it was producing DMT, it would be in extremely small quantities. And even then, we don't really understand how that would. There may be many, many different pathways between endogenous DMT and endogenous MAO inhibitors, monoamine oxidase, which normally breaks down DMT. You know, we don't quite know how that would interact as well. Perhaps it potentiates the DMT, or perhaps it destroys it.
Yeah, it's definitely a puzzle that is revealing itself quite slowly. But like you say, you know, Strassman in the 90s, and it's kind of like this somewhat, in some circles, romanticized idea of,
definitely,
right?
Yeah.
But then in other, like, you look at what we're learning now, like, and a lot of it, like you said, we've clinically recorded these, you know, these experiences that people have, and and so when you kind of go back to the idea of serotonin and melatonin, you know, we know dreams, for instance, and we know that, you know, the dominance of melatonin in the body.
And darkroom meditations, I think, are really good evidence for endogenous DMT, that when you deprive, the human system of light, after about 3 days, people start experiencing N-dimethyltryptamine-like effects and visions. And then, you know, come 5-6 days, they start becoming more like 5-MeO DMT, and, you know, less colourful and playful, and more just unitary and spacious, and so this has got to be. It's
a phenomenon where it feels like we're on the road to understanding.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's talk about the Acacia specifically, because I think this is a really interesting, because I think most people that have kind of been in this space have probably heard the Strassman and kind of, you know, the ayahuasca. The Acacia story is really, and, you know, even the existence of, you know, people generally know maybe that Acacia species contain certain forms of DMT. So what's your, I mean, in terms of the, it's one of the oldest plants on the planet.
Yeah, I would say, it's a very early form of flowering plant, anyway.
Yeah. And what percentage of acacias have DMT in the different types?
It's an enormous species. I think there's about 10,000 species of acacia under the Mimosae or Fabaceae family. There's acacia and there's wattle as well. So the wattles obviously has the feathery-like leaves, whereas an acacia grows those initially, but then it pushes that leaf out with a phyllodes, which for all intents and purposes is a leaf to us, looks like a leaf, but it's actually part of the trunk plant body. Just not technically a leaf, it's a phyllodes. I think probably, you know, there's probably hundreds of acacias that have some DMT in them. There would probably be, I'd say, half a dozen that are commonly used and are really viable for you know, a home, so acid-base extraction. Mimosa hostilis, Acacia confusa would be the the two most commonly used sources of DMT, and both of those generally tend to use the root bark, which is the highest concentration of DMT. It can be up to 3% sometimes in mimosa, which is a massive amount. Acacia confusa can be up to about 1.5, 1.6, 7, 8. But a third of that's also NMT, monomethyltryptamine, which doesn't generally crystallize, comes out as an oil. So it's another very under-researched compound, but plays a huge part in the experience because most acacias have small amounts of NMT in them. It's less visual, far more sort of spatial and almost auditory as well. It's a very, very different effect. And obviously when you look at acacias that have a number of different profiles, different levels of DMT and NMT and perhaps 5-MeO-DMT, you create an entourage effect. The plant creates an entourage effect. And I believe there's probably even forms of DMT or tryptamines in acacias that we haven't really even discovered yet. And that could well be the case. But yeah, there's probably, I'd say, a dozen species that are viable for an extraction. The unfortunate thing about the popularity of Acacia confusa and mimosa root bark is that people then believe that you need the root bark to extract from, or bark. And there's no single acacia in Australia that requires bark to source DMT. Equal amounts of DMT can be gotten from the phyllodes, from the leaves, and I can't stress that enough, because I've seen in very sacred sites of very rare acacias, people stripping the bark off living trees and leaving them to die just for the DMT. Now that's really sad because these are incredibly intelligent plants and very, very special, wise old trees. So just the phyllodes, just the leaves for all intents and purposes.
Interestingly too, we were talking before how they have natural defense mechanisms when an animal will eat them, they'll release tannins, which are actually poison.
Yeah.
And they release it's like a gas into the air to warn the other plants.
Yeah, like a pheromone, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, they're basically talking to each other, saying, hey, here's this giraffe munching on one of us. Quickly, all release this tannin, or release this enzyme into the air that will tell the other acacias to release its tannins so the animal will stop eating us. Plant intelligence. Yeah.
And the Nilotica obviously is the one that grows up and down the Nile, but there are species in Africa, across Asia, and many across Australia. Are there any other? Because it grows in hot climates, doesn't it?
There are some cold climate acacias as well. There's acacias growing out in Tasmania, obviously Victoria, even micro-endemic acacias in Victoria that grow in one singular alpine area. They seem to be extremely adaptable plants too. Some you can take off out of their micro-endemic climate and they'll grow prolifically in other areas. Ones that are perhaps more subtropical and more adaptable. Ones from alpine areas that are micro-endemic you can try and grow, and very few people succeed at getting them past about 2 years old. There's something about that micro-endemic climate that they really need. Maybe it's something in the soil. We know that there's a sort of rhizomal microbial interaction with acacias and the soil around it. It's a nitrogen exchange from what I remember. And
have you come across much knowledge from Indigenous Australian?
This is a very contentious issue.
Right.
Everyone says, hey, is there evidence that Indigenous people of Australia use acacia for its DMT? And well, very few Indigenous societies live in ignorance of the potentials of all their plants and animal species. They know, the various abilities and potentials and properties of every single plant. You don't live that in tune with the natural world without really knowing. Even through trial and error over tens of thousands of years allows a a culture to experiment and discover. When you look at the Dreamtime, when you look at Indigenous dot art, when you hear the Didge, Yidaki, it resonates with the Acacia experience so deeply that you just know, From an anthropological perspective, the colonisation of Australia was just utter genocide, and through that we decimated knowledge. But even within those intact cultures prior to colonisation, knowledge of a psychoactive compound like DMT would have been kept very secret because of its power. You wouldn't be transmitting that knowledge to everyone in the group and the tribe because it dilutes the power. It's kept for initiation, and the knowledge of how to work with those plants that contain DMT would have been learnt over an entire lifetime. Whether that's a shamanistic society that chooses someone, or someone appears to be chosen for the shamanic path and is then, initiated from a young age, or every member of the tribe is initiated at a certain age, say 14, via an Akashic ritual, to understand the Dreamtime stories that are told of their lives. I mean, this is how the peyote ceremony works: is it's at teenage years, they sit in the teepee and they drink peyote, but that confirms to them the reality of the myths and legends they have been told, how the universe works, all the stories. It's confirmation, like a Catholic confirmation. It's proof and evidence that these things are real experientially. They're not just stories we've been told as children. And so within Australian Indigenous culture, yes, this would have been kept very secret. It'd just be the wise old ones, the wise fellows that knew how to work with the plants and how to serve it to initiates. And perhaps also from the distance and the geography of Australia and the power dynamic of colonialism, we really didn't make inroads into Indigenous knowledge. I think to our detriment, we ignored much of the knowledge of this land is, somehow inferior due to the sort of, patriarchal nature of colonialism. But perhaps it's a good thing that this knowledge is kept sacred. But then again, it if it's not transmitted through each generation, it disappears.
Yeah, it's certainly a theme across the globe, that traditional cultures just, like you say, they had like a shamanistic use of application of whether it's DMT or a psychoactive. Ayahuasca is obviously one of the better known ones, and it is a very, very deep and treasured ritual in the community. And Indigenous Australian culture is certainly known for its keeping knowledge and tradition sacred, but also its connection to the land. It's
as an oral tradition too. There's power in an oral tradition in that, or a non-written tradition, in that when you are given knowledge, the impetus to learn that and hold it so that you can then pass it on is so much more powerful, because you're not relying on written word and records, which can then lead to misinterpretation, reinterpretation, as we see with the Bible and that sort of thing. It can lead to sort of maybe perhaps a laziness, and that you don't need to remember as much. And then again, a power dynamic comes in that only those that can read and write get to be guardians of the knowledge. Whereas it's not so much that it's an oral tradition, because it's far more than that. It's that instead of writing the land as the record, the stories are in the land and the voices of the ancestors are in the land. It's ideographic, pictographic. They can read the shapes of the stones and the riverways, and they become mimetic markers, points of memory. So on a initiation route over many, many miles, They would sit down next to a particular stone, be told a particular story, and they can revisit that with their children, and that stone becomes the memory trigger for that piece of knowledge. So it is very much the land that is holding the knowledge, and the people are born off the lands. We're all born off the lands.
I mean, the Indigenous Australian culture is one of the oldest, surviving cultures in the world now. Like, what are your thoughts on, obviously, we know the South American traditions on ayahuasca, and we now know, Egyptian and Mesopotamian use of Acacia DMT. What are your thoughts on, potentially these kind of traditions maybe, originating or somehow beginning from Indigenous Australian origins?
Yeah, we were talking about it's all sort of predicated on the out of Africa theory, but shamanism is the oldest religion, and anthropology's acknowledged that for a long time, that pretty much every society has at its core at one point in time a type of shamanism. It gets a bit problematic in that the term shamanism was the word Sami shaman is taken from the Sami Finnish word for that role in society, and then the anthropology of the Western Academy then applied that term to every other culture that had a similar dynamic. So to call South American ayahuasca traditions shamanism is a little bit colonialistic in that they have their own words for that role, like curandero or curandera, ayahuasquero, or whatever it may be, whatever plant that person works with, tabaquero if he's working with tobacco. And so if you look at out of Africa theory, where it's supposedly human origin branches out, comes down to Australia, and it goes up to the north, and then eventually across the Bering Strait when it was a land bridge, and down into America. I mean, the general consensus of that is that the New World, as they call it, the Americas, were the most recently sort of inhabited, other Pacific Islands and smaller countries, but one of the more recently inhabited continents. But the Americas have such a proliferation of psychoactive plants. I mean, particularly in South America and up into Mexico. I mean, such a diverse range of different plants with different psychoactive
It goes
properties.
to the different tribes of Brazil and Peru, and they all have their different applications. It's quite detailed, isn't it? And
even the diversity in ayahuasca traditions. The West sort of became aware of ayahuasca through rubber plantations and the rubber booms, the late 19th century and early 20th century. There's sort of two waves. But when they bought, they cleared land, they cleared rainforests, they brought Indians to work in the field, natives to work in the field, they brought, Spanish settlers to work in the fields, and then the mestizo populations in between that. And different tribes coming from very different areas of the Amazon to work in these plantations, usually in slave labor, I imagine. It was quite brutal too, the rubber industry and the exploitation of resources there was essentially slavery. But they discovered, through communicating with each other, that they all were using this vine in different ways. Some from further north were using the Chalaponga for their source of DMT, which is by all experiential accounts is said to contain 5-MeO-DMT. Now their mythology is very much one of light and star beings, whereas further south in Peru, chacruna is the DMT admixture to the vine, which is much more colourful and full of spirits. And back to the point though that there was all these different tribes using the ayahuasca vine in different ways. And then when we get up through into sort of the Western discovery of psychedelics and interest, and people like Burroughs and Ginsberg going down to the Amazon, Burroughs going down the Amazon, and the Yahe letters, and some of these early pioneers in the 60s. Oh, what's this ayahuasca?
It's only that recent, isn't it?
It's very recent. Yeah. And then as that gets written about, it gets into the sort of public consciousness, the public psyche, and then more and more people start going and looking for it. And so by the 90s, you almost have this industry arising to cater for Westerners looking for ayahuasca, and then we've seen various waves since then of it growing and growing and growing to now. There's every other sort of American sitcom has some sort of slight reference to ayahuasca. Oh, I'm doing ayahuasca ceremony this weekend. It's just sort of become this new age thing, and so that drives an industry that therefore caters to Westerners' expectations, and so the brews change because we're visual culture. We want visual stimulus. Everyone wants the visions, and so they start putting more and more DMT with the vine. They start putting other things like brugmansia, tropanes, which can be very, very misused. It's traditionally associated more with the sorcery side of things, and that's really common in the ayahuasca traditions as well. In their own non-Western application of ayahuasca, there's a lot of sorcery going on. Different shamans looking to gain power over others. Ayahuasca was often used to foresee coming events, to foresee what another tribe is doing, perhaps if they're about to attack, or to find lost objects. Even someone's lost their goats, and drink some ayahuasca and see, oh right, they're over there in that field. And then sure enough, there they are. And so you get even the brew changing, and obviously all the songs develop around that, and they get transmitted through each ceremony. So it builds its own sort of culture, its own hybrid culture. It's an extremely hybrid phenomenon.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that what we kind of know about it now is very, very kind of recent and very limited view of.
Yeah, there's I think some archaeological evidence that traces ayahuasca back about 4,000 years.
Was it Yopo? Yeah,
there's the Yopo snuff from Anadenanthera peregrina and Sibyl and some other plants that have a compound of 5-MeO-DMT and NN-DMT and mixed with harmful alkaloids and administered as a snuff. So essentially, for all intents and purposes, pharmacologically ayahuasca, but administered as a snuff, which is also very, very common throughout the Americas, the use of snuffs, rape, tobacco snuffs. And even very recently, I think it was about 6 months ago maybe, there was a discovery of a shaman's pouch, and it was made out of fox snouts. And inside, this was, I think, in southern Mexico, I might be wrong, or northern Yucatan, I'm not sure. And interestingly enough, a pouch with snuffs is made out of snouts of a fox. But yeah, they found the traces of I think they found carpi vine and traces of DMT. And snuff tools, little snuff tools,
yeah,
and bones.
It goes back thousands of years. It's globally, What really kind of interests me is like how globally endemic it is, to cultures, and seemingly separated but using the same process.
Yeah. See, ayahuasca is, the jungle. It's the Amazon. You really didn't find it outside of the jungle until Western, discovery of it and spread of it. And hence you find it pretty much growing everywhere now. You'll find ayahuasca ceremonies in almost every city, every continent in the West, anyway. And that's also partly catalysed by the religions that formed out of the rubber boom, the Santo Daime, the Unidad Vegetal, they formed most of those leaders who let's protect this practice, but let's create a space where people can gather and drink the plants and worship. But I think they also created these religions as a way of safekeeping their practices from colonialism, as did the peyote churches and even the mushroom rituals, as they adopted Christian iconography, so that if the conquistadors would come in and say, what are you doing? They outlawed the use of peyote and these psychoactive plants because it was seen as demonic and devilish. But if they were to sort of, what are you doing? Oh, we're just doing a Christian ritual, because hey, here's all this Christian iconography. But also the power of conversion into that religion under fear of death. So But that sort of protected these practices to some extent. And you find in the ayahuasca religions incredibly syncretic. They've got aspects of African Ubuntu and Voodoo and Brazilian. Brazil's a very diversely religious place anyway, but yeah, you see it inside these ayahuasca churches, really incredibly unique symbols and practices and ways of interpreting the ayahuasca experience.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like we kind of move on to how we're seeing this play out now in this modern day with researchers starting to understand the DMT, but really it does seem like we need to kind of go back and really understand what these ancient cultures knew and practiced about this. And the diversity, I think, is just there's so much to be learned there, like you say, like all the different kind of flavors and practices that people put towards it. What would you like to see in terms of how this plays out in the next few years?
Well, it is playing out in so many different ways. As you said, we've got this wave of clinical research and corporations moving into that space to sort of profit off. Hey, it's not like psilocybin or MDMA is a daily pill like say Prozac. It's usually a one-off or a couple of sessions with a therapist, and so it's contained within that therapeutic environment, but there's still actors moving to that space looking to make money because this is happening. And we have particularly in America, we have sort of freedom of religion that protects a lot of the ayahuasca churches there. There's so many different ways, as you said. I think what I'd like to see is the sort of rebirth of modern mystery schools. Not necessarily under the structure of religion, but a very open, safe place where people can go and consume these plants as sacraments in a safe space, be looked after in a ceremonial environment, but are left to their own interpretation. That there's no dogma, there's no sort of particular way of interpreting or navigating the experiences left to the individual, but obviously would have some protection around it legally as a legitimate spiritual practice.
Yeah, that's an interesting, in terms of how we interface this into a modern society, and the legalization of these things are happening now, right? So integration of safe spaces would definitely be a way, because obviously the one big concern with all this is the safe application, right?
Yeah, and people will still take it, recreationally on their own, just out of curiosity, and perhaps might not be as safe as they could be. But this is just education. It's the only thing you can really counter it with. I mean, it's like everything. It's like high risk sports, or you can't just be protecting people against every possible risk that exists in the world. Get hit by a bus, outlaw buses. You just teach people to cross the road properly.
Well, the amazing thing about Acacia and DMT, that it is so prevalent across nature, so it does seem like there is some application we should understand and know, right?
Yeah. And everyone's approaching it with different reasons, with different intentions. There's no real right or wrong other than the sort of fundamentals of safety and respect. I mean, the thing is, you approach these plants without respect, recklessly or carelessly, and they'll teach you a lesson. They'll teach you some respect. I hear people saying, there's no such thing as a bad trip. It's just an experience to learn from. Well, if you get your set and setting wrong, that's a bad trip. You might learn not to, have a huge amount of mushrooms in the middle of the city on a, Saturday night or something where it's not particularly safe. So there can be such thing as a bad trip. You just haven't got all the elements right. Yeah. So that's just education. That's all you can do.
Exactly. Education, understand. Yeah. And, hopefully we do have this good understanding, building and cultivating these, these safe spaces. Just been a pleasure. It's
I don't think we really even got into the Acacia too much, did we?
Well, you know what? Like, yeah, it's such a story. Like,
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
we're definitely gonna be diving into that. Again,
As
right?
you're saying with the ayahuasca culture, is by comparison, Acacia use is far older.
Yeah.
It is. It was often just seen as a substitute for DMT plants used in ayahuasca in the Amazon. But no, I think now we're recognizing Acacia as a true power plant in its own right, not as just a admixture substitute for, Amazonian DMT plants.
Yeah, and that story is particularly. Yeah, we'll definitely have to look to come back and revisit that one. Yeah. As you said, it's a deep topic, so we can
absolutely
jump into that one. Yeah,
and I think the time is really right for Acacia to come into its own right now.
absolutely.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Stephen.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Thank you for listening to today's show. For more information, you can read the full transcript, articles, and discussion on our website, humanoriginproject.com. You can visit us on social media at Human Origin Project on Facebook and The Human Origin Project on Instagram. Follow us on Twitter or join the forum boards and email list to keep up to date with all the new information. And if you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review, because it helps others to find this information and helps us to bring you the topics you want to discuss and hear about. Until next week, I hope your life is filled with happiness, healthiness, and harmony.